So I've only got a couple of slides just to set us up for today, and then we'll go into a demo. So as Sarah introduced, we'll be looking at task management, and we'll be focusing on a couple of the apps in KWIZ apps which are available. The first one of those is Forms. So we're only going to touch on Forms briefly. We have done other Forms webinars in the past if you're interested in those, but we will show an example of a customized SharePoint list form, both in SharePoint and in Teams, and how we can build and configure that within a few minutes using things like cascading lookups, parent-child items, and various data validation rules, as well as laying out the form in a rich way. The second toolset app, which we're going to be looking at today, is the Data View app. Data View app is actually made up of a number of different apps. As Sarah mentioned, we can aggregate data from different data sources, whether that's SharePoint, multiple SharePoint lists, Excel, Microsoft Graph, and we can present that in a variety of different ways, as a SharePoint table, as a picture gallery, org chart, as a calendar. And we can also easily introduce additional capabilities, additional components to do things like filter that web part, present it in different ways with tabs and groupings, and also apply things like rich conditional formatting. It's ideal when you want to visualize data from different data sources. We're going to use the example of tasks today, and I'll show you a few different ways around how we can firstly create those tasks, but then how we can visualize those tasks. A couple of things which are really important. At KWIZ, we don't hold your data off of your Microsoft tenant. So a number of the other solutions, especially for forms, will operate in terms of a provider hosted app. So do you know where that data is being stored? The form will not actually run within your tenant. So that could be stored in another data center, even in another country outside of your jurisdiction. That's not what we do with KWIZ. The thing which we're showing today is client side. So it's enhancements to SharePoint forms, it's web parts on your SharePoint site. So your data never leaves your Microsoft 365 tenant. That's really important for organizations who value security and want to know where their data is being stored. It's also worth saying, as well as working in SharePoint and Teams, the forms and the data view apps, which I'm going to show you today, are fully responsive. So obviously a lot of users nowadays work on mobile devices, tablets, and you can work in those environments as if you were working in the same way through a web browser as well. And finally, I've mentioned it a few times, but it's obviously very important because it's so key to how we work today. Everything which I'm going to show you will work both in SharePoint pages, SharePoint lists, but they'll also work within a tab within your Microsoft Teams channel. So your Microsoft list within Teams channel will use the forms which we're customizing today. And the Data View Plus to visualize and aggregate data can also be added as a tab to Microsoft Teams. And I'll show you that towards the end of the demonstration. So let's move straight into a demonstration. So I'm going to start with showing you a form. So I'm logged in as a user who wants to complete an expenses form. This is a regular SharePoint site, and I've got a list for expenses, but I've enhanced that with KWIZ forms. I'll zoom in a little bit so we can see what we're seeing today. And then I'm going to go and just create a new item. I've already customized this list, but I'll show you completing an item, and then we'll have a look at how we've gone about configuring those customizations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and complete an expenses request, and that's going to have certain rules and validation associated with it. And then I'm also going to initiate a workflow to go and assign a task to the user's manager. So here we see a form. So this is a regular SharePoint list, but you'll notice immediately we've got some customizations. The title here is locked. I can't change it. It's picking up my name. So it's picking up the username here, and it's also picking up the date, and it's concatenating those into a title. I've also got a date field here, which is automatically being set with today's date. So there's some immediate customizations. You'll also notice that the form is laid out in a different way. I'm not just looking at a column of fields. There's multiple columns. It's actually a full width screen as well. These are all options which we can configure. I've also got some countries here, so a drop-down field. So I can go and select a specific country. And you'll notice the city field activates to then show me options dependent on what I've selected in country. So we can do what's called a cascading field, so an interdependent lookup. Based on what I select in one field, that will present me options in another field. And I'll show you how I've built all of this in a few minutes, but we can go and set those fields appropriately. In addition to standard text fields and choice fields, interdependent drop-down fields like this, I can also have what's called repeating rows or child items. So here I'm completing the expenses form. So I'm asked to specify, well, what are the expenses which I've incurred? So I was flying to the US last week, so I can start to populate this. And each of these rows can have things like validation on them. So depending on the field values I enter, it can have validation. And I can start to build that up with information. I can insert additional rows. I can remove rows if I'm not using them. I can also support attachments. So if I want to add things like receipts, I can add those as well. But I've completed my form, so I'm just going to go ahead and save that request. Now, what that's going to do in the background is it's going to initiate a workflow. And that workflow is going to go and look up who my manager is. And it's then going to allocate a task to that manager. And it's also going to send that person an email to say, here is your expense. I must have put some validation on there. So let's just go ahead and save that again. There we go. So my expense has been submitted. I'll now switch over to my admin user, which I'm going to use for the rest of the demo. So I'm now logged in as my admin account. And I heard a ping in my ear, which means I've got an email. So let's go and have a look at that first of all. So I can see that a new approval task has been assigned. It's picking up who it's been assigned from. And I've also got a link to that task. So I can click on that link and it will take me through to that task where I can access the approval and I can choose to approve or reject it dependent on my configuration. In addition, I can actually show you this list directly in screen. So I've got an approvals task list. My task is loaded now. So here's my task created. And you see it's pulling through certain bits of information. So it's pulling through the title. It's setting who the assigned to is. That's looking up the manager of the user. It just happens to be this user. It's set the due date. And what it's doing in my configuration is adding 3 days to the due date. And then it's setting that status to be pending. How have I implemented all of that? Well, let's have a look at all of that before I move on to the next part of the demo. So I've got my form configured and I've got my approval task created. And for reference, my approval tasks are stored within this separate list called approval tasks. Let's wait for that to load a second. Everything decided to run a little bit slowly just as I've started the demo today. And let's load that again. So there you go. So you can see my different approval tasks which I've got created as well as the status associated with them. So how have I configured that? Well, let me show you some of the components which make this environment up. I've got my expenses list. You can see I've got a few columns here. I've also got a list for countries. And I've got a list here for cities. And you'll notice the cities are associated to a country. Finally, I've also got a hidden list called expense lines. So here are my lines for my expenses. Yeah. So how have I configured all of this? So you'll notice here that I've got something called KWIZ apps. If I click on that, I've got various options which I've enabled for my site and then will become enabled for my list. Firstly, I've configured my cascading lookup. So my cascading lookup is like a regular lookup column, but I can filter based on another column. So firstly, I've got a column here called country. This goes and looks in my current site and goes and looks at my countries list and looks at my title. So that one doesn't have any additional filtering. The second list I've got is called city. Here I look at the city list, I look at the title column, but you'll then notice I've applied a filter. So I've filtered based on a column from a specific list. So I've gone and looked up my country field in my master list, and then I'm going and looking at the appropriate column from the looked up list. So here I'm going and looking at the cities list and I'm filtering based on country. That gives me the functionality which we'd have seen earlier, which was when we selected a country, then the city field then became enabled for me to filter it appropriately. What other settings have we enabled? So we've also enabled things like dynamic column permissions. So you'll have noticed that I disabled the title field and I also disabled the date field. So in here, with each column, I can choose to show, hide, or disable in different types of form experience, whether that's a new form, whether that's an edit form, whether that's a view form. I can also apply certain conditions if a certain value is met or a user is of a certain type. So if it's the current user or if it's they're a member of a specific group. I also set a default value. So you'll see that the date field, for instance, is set to today. So when we're configuring properties in KWIZ forms, we can use various tokens such as today or today plus a certain time or other column values. I also had that repeating table. So you recall that I had that repeating table of expenses. This is really easy to set up. So you'll notice that I'll open this up in another tab. I had this additional list called expenses lines. So I pre-configured this list with my columns which I want to capture about my expenses. When I configure a repeating row column, again, I look and reference a specific list. In this case, it's a child list, essentially. I define the number of items which I want to include in that list, a number of rows to display by default, and then I can also define which columns I want to include and any additional settings such as totals or counts. Finally, to sort of put this all together, I can configure my form layout. So in my form layout, I can add one or more tabs. So you can see here I can add additional tabs to my form. And in each tab, I get a group layout. And I can add rows to this layout. And each row starts with one column, and I can go and select any specific columns. I can also use HTML elements like horizontal lines or buttons. I can also adjust this, so I can add additional columns if I want to. I can resize a specific column to break out how I want those displayed on screen. I can add additional tabs as I've done here. And you'll notice my lines, my repeating rows column has been added as an option for me to add in. So I can just come here and select from my available options. Finally, I can also add things like conditions. So I might say that a certain tab is only displayed under a certain condition. So that's how I built up some of the forms functionality which we saw earlier when I went and created a new request, that I defined my cascading lookup, I defined my different tabs, I've defined my repeating rows, as well as my validation, which I've put in place. What else have I done? So we've also got a workflow running here. We saw that when my approval task got created. So our workflow is made up of two components, activities and custom actions. So activities are individual steps which you design to make up your workflow, and custom actions link those steps together. You'll notice we've got a range of activities which we configure. Adding items, copying items, emails, getting column values, getting profile properties, even connecting to external services if we wanted to. In my case, I've created 3. So the first one, which goes and gets the approver, because I need to know who the manager of the user is when they request or submit a expenses form. So I'm using the get user profile properties. Here I can then define what property it is I'm getting. So I can get various properties from the user from Active Directory, or Entra ID as it's now called. And in my case, I can choose to define how I get the manager. So I could look up different attributes about the request to get the manager. So in here, I could go and look at various list columns. But what I'm doing is I'm storing that as a variable. So I'm saying I will give my workflow a variable of requester, And then from that variable, go and look up the manager of the requester. And this will make sense in a second as I get to it. So I get the approver. Next, I will go and create the task. So here I add an item, and I'm selecting the current site, and I'm selecting the list approval tasks. And in this case, I'm defining the expenses approval with a variable of name. I'm setting the due date to be today plus 3 days, and I'm setting the assigned to be a variable of approver. Okay. Finally, I'm sending an email. So I'm sending an email to the approver, and I'm basing this on who's it going to go to. So in this case, it's going to a variable of approver. I'm going to go and set these different ones in a second. I've got a subject, and then I've got an approval task has been assigned from the requester name, and my link is also going to be dynamically configured. So my link includes a customizable link, and we'll come to that again in a second. So these are my 3 components which I'm going to use, and I've designed to work within my workflow. How do we use them together? So we use them together in a custom action. So here I've got a custom action called expense approval. There are 2 types of action. One is called automatic. So that's on an item being added, an item being deleted, an item being updated. The other one is a user action. So that will essentially add a button to the form, allowing the user to choose to initiate a custom action. As I mentioned, a custom action is made up of these activities, so these individual components. And you see I've got 3 configured here. So firstly, and so when we go and configure this, we can add from our defined activities. So you're configuring these components and then you're defining them. You can also have conditions which you can add these to. Mine always runs. So here I'm going to go and get the user property of manager for requester. And if I click on that, I can see what it's going to do. So I've said I want to get that property, and then I can go and set who the requester is. So I've gone and looked at the current item and looked at the author field. So I've gone in here and I've gone item system properties, and I've looked at who created it, because that's who I want to see and go and get the manager for, because that person requested that form. And note, it will store that in an output called output 1. Next, I'm going to go and add a task. So I'm going to add a task using my add task activity, and it's going to go and set the title. I've gone and set the name to be the title of the current item. Obviously, the due date is automatically set, and then my approver is my output from the previous step. So my previous step went and got the manager. It stored that in an output of 1, and then I can use that moving forward. So in here, I can go and look at output from previous activity. So I can link these together as I dynamically build my workflow. Finally, I'm sending an email. So I'm sending an email to the approver. I'm using that same output. And then here I've set who the requester is, the author again, and I'm building the link. So I've built the link to my task, and output 2 is the output from the create task activity. So you notice the create task activity stores the ID. So I can build up my workflow as I go through. And so that's how it's creating me that task. That's also how it's building out that email for my task. So that's how we use KWIZ Forms to build a custom form, but also to build these workflows. There's lots of other scenarios we could work through with workflows. I also wanted to point out we also have the new scheduled actions capability. So scheduled actions is exactly the same, but instead of being trigger based, it's based on a schedule. So here you can see I can build out a schedule for my activities to run in, and in the same way I can build out my different activities. So whether that's automatic when an item is created or added, or user-driven action, or scheduled, all of these actions can have multiple steps to build out my workflow. So that's how we build a form, that's how we build a workflow to create tasks. How do we visualize that data? Well, I've got an example here. So here I'm using the DataView Plus app to visualize the tasks from my approval task list. But you'll notice it's presented very differently to a standard SharePoint task list. I've got 2 different tabs here showing the status complete, the status pending. I've got the ability to search by who it's assigned to, so I can filter my list. I can even add a new item here. I can export the data out to CSV. And I also have some custom actions here, which let me open, email, or my own configurable custom actions. So this is where we've used the Data View Plus. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete this, and I'll show you how I built this out. So we can come in here and we can search for the Data View Plus app. I can then come in and I can immediately configure what my data source is. So you'll notice that we need to give it a name. So we'll call it approval tasks. And then we can then select what type of data are we working with. So are we working with an Excel file? Are we working with user profiles, SharePoint lists? SharePoint list aggregator allows us to aggregate data from multiple sites at once. Or we're also working with the Microsoft Graph API as well. So I'm going to choose a SharePoint list here. When I choose a SharePoint list, I can then select either my current site or a different SharePoint site URL. And then I can then select what list I'm looking at. So I'm going to select approval tasks. Note how we can also select what view we want to display. There are other settings here for column mappings, but we don't need to do that with a standard SharePoint list. So that's my data source configured. You'll notice here that the web part has automatically set up a basic configuration. So within the basic mode, we can make certain changes to this configuration, but they're somewhat limited. It's giving me like a base setup. It's really simple to customize this though. So I can switch to advanced mode. Now, we've got a couple of different ways we can display data. So that includes in this sort of list style or in a tabular style. So I'm going to choose tabular. There are also other types of controls dependent on different types of data sources. So I'm immediately really happy with this style here, but I can make some changes. So for example, I can come in here and say, well, actually, I only want certain columns displayed. So I would like the title displayed. I'd like the assigned to column displayed, and I'd like the due date displayed. You'll also see I've got some different actions by default, including things like edit item in a new window, and there's a number of standard actions available for me to use, as well as we can build out custom actions. In addition to this, you'll see I've got other controls. I've got the option to page. I don't think I want that, so I'm going to remove that. I've also got folders. I'm actually going to switch that to tabs. So immediately it makes a decision for me about how that should be tabbed. And actually, that's what I want. In this case, I want it tabbed based on status. But you'll notice I can change that but to different types of fields, as well as the displaying it as a grouped by view. In addition, I can add other options, other components to build up this control. I'll look at conditional formatting in a minute. I can also add a filter here. It starts with a free text filter. I'm actually going to remove that, and then I'm going to add my own filters here. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to say I'd like assigned to add as a filter. You can also, if someone puts a filter in here, you can actually save that by default and everyone then has access to that filter. And there you go. I've just very, very quickly recreated that display with quite rich data to present my tasks in different ways and also add my filters on top. But we can do a lot more. So let's show a couple of other examples of how we can do more with our data. Firstly, I've got another task list here called finance tasks. So tasks for the finance team, there's a few different owners. There's some dates forthcoming in May. So instead of displaying that as a list, I've used the calendar control. And if I move across to April, you'll see, so into May, you can see my items are displayed in a calendar because I've got a date component. So when we can configure our app, we instead of just choosing the Data View Plus, I can choose, I'll switch to advanced mode. I can choose different ways which I want to display that data. So you see I've got a range of controls available. So I chose the calendar control because that allows me a different form of presentation. As I mentioned, we can talk about pictures, we can talk about org charts as well. In addition to those two SharePoint lists, I also have a document in my document library which is got some tasks listed in it. So it's just an Excel spreadsheet with some tasks included. Again, assigned to specific people with similar columns. What's nice is the Data View Plus allows us to pull all of that data together. So here I've consolidated that data in a single web part, and I've chosen to break that down by the different data sources, but you could actually continue to break that down by status. And you can see as I move between them, I've got different tasks listed, and I've also got some conditional formatting. I've still got my assigned to column, so I can filter my data appropriately. Just to show you a couple of quick bits around how they've configured that. So I've added the conditional formatting component, and in there I can add multiple different controls. I can look at what field it's formatting. So in my case, I'm formatting on due date. I can define how it's coloring it. So is it based on an icon? Is it the text color? Is it the background color? So here I've got one for red, one for amber, and then I can define conditions. So I'm saying if the due date is less than today and the status is not pending, then set it as red. And if the due date is equal to today and the status is equal to pending, again, set it to, in this case, to amber. Here you'll see that I've defined my tabs, and I've just defined, I can use data source as a filtering option. Equally, I could have used status to present it in a different way. The advantage of the data source is on the actual configuration of my data sources, you see I've defined 3 different data sources here. My approval tasks, my finance tasks, and also my projects tasks, which connect to an Excel file. And when I'm working with other data sources, I might need to map and explain that data source to the app. So in this case, I've defined the due date as a date column, because otherwise it will just come in as text. Finally, to wrap up our session today, I also just wanted to emphasize that all of this capability I've shown you is also available in Microsoft Teams. So here I've got my Microsoft list for expenses. You see that here, but I can click on that and I'm opening my quiz form, but I'm still in Microsoft Teams. Equally, I can add the Data View Plus app as an app into my Microsoft team and then in a channel, and I can just come in here and connect to a data source. So exactly the same principle. I can connect to a list. I can connect to my approval tasks. I'll give my data source a name. And then I can then start to configure my app in exactly the same way. So I can come in here and just go to, and I can just start to configure it using exactly the same settings. So I've got all of those options exactly the same to me as if I was working with it in SharePoint. And I can just add another one here. So you see here the Data View Plus app is added. It might take a second to add in Teams. And then that is available to configure in exactly the same way as I just showed you. So let's just return to PowerPoint for a second. So today I've shown you a few key things. I've shown you how to configure a form, how to add cascading fields, validation, and repeating rows. I've then shown you how our workflow components of activities and actions can be used to create tasks. Then I've shown you how to display those tasks in different ways using the Data View Plus app with controls such as calendar, conditional formatting, tabs, and other settings. And then finally, I've shown you how those data sources can be consolidated, presented in SharePoint, and also presented in Microsoft Teams. So with that, I will say thank you